Good day, everyone. So, today we are going to discuss the discourse analysis D part, which is the extension Readings in Discourse Analysis. So, let's proceed to the three perspectives revisited. So, first we have the Discourse Analysis by Zelig Harris, reprinted from Language 28, 1952, 1 to 13. So, in this perspective, the problem is that one can approach discourse analysis from the two types of problem. So we have the first problem is that the continuing descriptive linguistics beyond the limits of a single sentence at a time. And the other one is that the question of correlating culture and language, an example in non-linguistic and linguistic behavior. So the first problem arises because descriptive linguistics generally stops at sentence boundaries. This is not due to any prior decision, and the techniques of linguistics were constructed to study any stretch of speech of whatever length. But in every language, it turns out that almost all the results lie within a relatively short stretch, which we may call a sentence. So now let's proceed to the distribution within discourse. So distributional or combinational analysis within one discourse at a time turns out to be relevant to both of these problems, just as we have mentioned earlier. But on the other hand, it carries us past the sentence limitation of descriptive linguistics. Although we cannot state the distribution of sentences or, excuse me, in general, any inter-sentence relation when we are given an arbitrary conglomeration of sentences in a language, we can get quite definite results about certain relations across sentence boundaries when we consider just the sentences of a particular connected discourse, that is, the sentences spoken or written in succession by one or more persons in a single situation. And considerably, there are restrictions to connect discourse, but it does not detract from the usefulness of the analysis since all the language occurrences are internally connected, and also the language does not occur in stray words or sentences, but in connected discourse from a one-word utterance to a 10-volume work, from a monologue to a Union Square argument. So here we have the nature of the method. So we have raised two problems just as stated again, that of the distributional relations among sentences and that of the correlation between language and social situation. We have proposed that information relevant to both of these problems can be obtained by a formal analysis of one stretch of discourse at a time. So the questions to be considered are, what kind of analysis would be applicable here? To decide this, we consider what is permitted by the material. So now let's proceed to the unapplied linguistic approach to discourse analysis by Henry G. Widowson. So Harris' aim is to apply or to simply to establish formal patterns without reference to meaning. But Harris nevertheless believes that his analysis has some bearing on how discourse is understood as communication. At first sight, it would appear that his aim is to contribute to studies of contextualized language in both of the senses distinguished at the beginning of this chapter. But in a prolegomenon to his actual analysis, he makes the comment, one can approach discourse analysis from two types of the problem, which turn out to be related. The first problem is the continuing descriptive linguistics beyond the limits of a single sentence at a time, and the other is the question of correlating culture and language, just as mentioned on the first part of this report. Moving on, here we have the two perspectives on texture. So we have four definitions to be defined by the concept of cohesion, Michael Halliday and Rokia Hassan. So we have first the text. It is used in linguistics to refer to any passage, spoken or written, of whatever length that docs form a unified whole. Now let's proceed to texture. It is entirely appropriate to express the property of being a text. Now, For ties, it is a term to refer to a single instance of cohesion, a term for one occurrence of a pair of cohesively related items. Then lastly, we have the cohesion itself. It refers to the relations of meaning that exist within the text and that define it as a text. So here we have a simple story grammar, and the grammar rules are depicted on the lesson are rule number 1, the story, the setting plus the episode. And then we also have excuse me, for rule number 2 is the setting and then the state. For rule number 3 we have the episode and the event and also the reaction. For rule number 5 we have the event, episode, change of state, action, event plus event. So lastly, we have the rule number 5, which is the reaction, internal response plus overt response.
Now, let's proceed to the three genres, discourse, communities, and power. The two excerpts below are from two important figures in the field of genre analysis. So in the first, John Swills clarifies the concept of discourse community by providing a 6 defining characteristics having to do with people's relationships to one another and to the text that they use together. So in the second, Vijay Bhatia discusses the tension between creativity and conformity in genre and how this relates to issues of power and politics among members of a discourse community. The first important figures in the field of genre analysis are the conceptualization of discourse community. So these propose 6 defining characteristics that will be necessary and sufficient for identifying a group of individuals as a discourse community. So first, a discourse community has a broadly agreed set of common public goals. So these public goals may be formally inscribed in documents, as is often the case with associations and clubs, or they may be more tacit. So the goals are public because spies may join speech and discourse communities for hidden purposes of subversion, while more ordinary people may join organizations with private hopes of commercial or romantic advancement, or in some instances, but not in many, the goals may be high level or abstract. Second, a discourse community has mechanisms of intercommunication among its members. So the participatory mechanisms will vary according to the community. Meetings, telecommunications, correspondence, newsletters, conversations, and so forth. So this criterion is quite stringent because it produces a negative answer to the case of the CAF problem cited by Najar in personal communication. So generalized form, the problem goes as follows. Individuals A, B, and C, and so on occupy the same professional roles in life. They interact in speech and writing with the same client list. They originate, receive, and respond to the same kind of messages for the same purposes. They also have an approximately similar range of general skills. And yet, as coffee owners working long hours in their own establishments and not being members of the local chamber of commerce, A, B, and C never interact with one another. Do they form a discourse community? So we can notice first that the cafe owner problem is not quiet like those situations where A, B, and C operate as point. A, B, and C may be lighthouse keepers on their lonely rocks, or missionaries in their separate jungles, or neglected consular officials in their routing outposts. So in all these cases, although A, B, and C may never interact, so they all have lines of communication back to base and presumably acquired discourse community membership as key element in their initial training. So number 3, a discourse community uses its participatory mechanisms primarily to provide information and feedback. So thus, the membership implies uptake of the informational opportunities. Individuals might pay an annual subscription to the Acoustical Society of America, but if they never open any of its communications, so they cannot be said to belong to the discourse community. Even though they are formally members of the society, the secondary purposes of the information exchange will vary according to the common goals. First is to improve performance in a football squad or in an orchestra, to make money in a brokerage house, to grow better roses in a gardening club, or to dent the research fund in an academic department. So next, number 4, a discourse community utilizes enhanced processes, one or more genres in the communicative furtherance of its aims. So a discourse community has developed and continues to develop discoursal expectations. These may involve appropriacy of topics, the form, function, and positioning of discursal elements, and the roles text plays in the operation of the discourse community. So, one of the purposes of this criterion is to question discourse community status for new or newly emergent groupings, such as groupings need, as it were, to settle down and work out their communicative proceedings and practices before they can be recognized as discourse communities. So, if a new grouping borrows genres from other discourse communities, such borrowings have to be assimilated. So number 5, in addition to owning genres, a discourse community has acquired some specific lexes. So this specialization may involve using lexical items known to the wider speech communities in special and technical ways, as in information technology discourse communities, or using highly technical terminologies and or as in medical communities. So most commonly, however, the inbuilt dynamic towards an increasingly shared and specialized terminology is realized through the development of community specific abbreviations and acronyms. And lastly, a discourse community has a threshold level of members with a suitable degree of relevant content and discoursal expertise. So the discourse communities have changing membership. So next, we have here an example of a discourse community. So as we have seen, those interested in discourse communities have typically cited their discussions within academic context, thus possibly creating a false impression that such communities are only to be associated with intellectual paradigms or scholarly cliques. Therefore, John Swale create an example of a discourse community, and he deliberately chosen one that is not academic but which nevertheless is probably typical enough of many others. So example, the discourse community is a hobby group and has an umbrella organization called the Hong Kong Study Circle, of which I happen to be a member. So the aims of the HKSC or Hong Kong Study Circle are to foster interest in and knowledge of the stamps of Hong Kong and of their uses, and it is currently there are about 320 members scattered across the world, but with major concentrations in Great Britain, the USA, and Hong Kong, China itself, and minor ones in Holland and Japan. So based on the membership list, is that about a third of the members are non-native speakers of English and about a fifth women. So the membership varies in other ways. A few are rich and have acquired world-class collections of classic rarities and pursue their hobby interests with material that costs a very little to acquire. So some are full-time specialist dealers, auctioneers, and catalog publishers, but most are collectors. So now we are done in first important figures in the field of genre and their characteristics by John Swale, and let us now know the issues to consider in this genre. So, the second criterion for a discourse community discussed by Swales is that members must have a means of intercommunication among members. He then, however, gives an example of people in the same profession. Let's say, for example, is coffee owners who do not necessarily have a means of communicating with one another. So, guys, do you think this group constitutes a discourse community? Why or why not? Or can you think of other groups that have a similar ambiguous status based on this criterion or other criteria listed by Swales? And next, issues to consider. What groups do you belong to that you think can be considered discourse communities? Or what genres are associated with these communities and how do you learn to use them? Swills says the newly formed groups take time to settle down and establish themselves as discourse communities. So can you think of any groups that are in the process of becoming discourse communities but have not yet attained full status? So now let's proceed to the second figures in the field of genre. So the power and politics of genre by Vijay K. Bhatia. First is complexity of generic forms. Although the generic forms are products of conventional knowledge embedded in disciplinary cultures, they are dynamic constructs. Typical realization of these institutionalized forms are often characterized by their generic integrity on the one hand and their propensity for innovation or on the other, by Bhatia 1993-1995. So these two aspects of genre may appear to be somewhat contradictory at first, but as we shall soon discover, these two characteristics are complementary to each other. In fact, it will be not inaccurate to suggest that one is, in a way, an essential prerequisite to the other. Generic integrity is the product of the conventional features of a specific generic construct, although these conventions are embedded in the rhetorical context, so they often constrain the use of linguistic resources, the lexicogrammatical as well as discoursal, and are frequently invoked to arrive at a reasonable interpretation of the genre or even determine the choice of the genre to suit a particular context. Within the generic boundaries, experienced users of genre often manage to exercise considerable freedom to manipulate generic conventions to respond to novel situations. Therefore, this tension between conformity and creativity, so often made an issue of in applied discourse studies, is not necessarily real. So the power of genre, there is no better illustration of this saying knowledge is power than the one in the case of generic power. Power to use, interpret, exploit, and innovate novel generic forms is the function of generic knowledge, which is accessible only to the members of disciplinary communities. So first, we have here the maintaining generic integrity editorial intervention. So in some forms of academic discourse, especially the research articles, one can see generally two kinds of mechanism in place to ensure generic integrity. So the peer review process and editorial intervention. Both these mechanisms, though operating at different levels, are actively invoked to ensure that all accounts of new knowledge conform to the standards of institutionalized behavior that is expected by a community of established peers in a specific discipline. Although individual judgments can vary within the membership of specific disciplinary communities, a high degree of consensus is often ensured by selecting like-minded scholars from within well-defined disciplinary boundaries. So after the peer review, the second most important interventions comes from the editors who enjoy all the power one can imagine to maintain the identity and integrity of the research article genre. by Birkenkotter and Haken, 1995, says that document an in-depth and fascinating study of this kind of editorial control to maintain generic integrity. So they point out that for the construction and dissemination of knowledge, textual activity is as important as the scientific activity. Next, generic conventions as authority. The case of citations and references. To us academics, the power of genre is nowhere better illustrated than in the publication of research articles. Swales, in his research report aspects of research article introductions in 1981, was the first one to point out the importance of the description of previous research on the rhetorical activity of knowledge dissemination as distinct from knowledge creation. In order to become acceptable to the specialist community of fellow researchers, one must relate his or her knowledge claims to the accumulated knowledge of the discipline, without which his or her claims in the field are unlikely to find recognition through publication. Next is power to innovate, mixing and embedding. So, although this pressure for the democratization by Fairclough 1992 of discourse is becoming increasingly intense in some countries, especially in the USA, so it is unlikely to make a significant dent in the so-called integrity of professional genres, at least not in the foreseeable future. However, one can see an increasing fragmentation of discursive norms and convention, often leading to genre mixing and embedding in institutionalized orders of discourse, on the one hand, and creation of new genres on the other. To a large extent, so these changes in discursive practices are making professional genres increasingly dynamic and complex. So the dynamic complexity of academic and professional communication is further increased by the role of multimedia, the explosion of information technology, the multidisciplinary context of the world of work, so the increasingly competitive professional environment, and above all, the overwhelmingly compulsive nature of promotional and advertising activities, so much so that our present day world of work is being increasingly identified as a consumer culture. And lastly, shared knowledge, privilege, access, insider information. So if the generic convention on the one hand give a suitable expression to the communicative intentions of genre writers, the genre writers who are members of a particular discourse community, they also match their intentions against their intended readers' expectations. So this is possible only when all the participants share not only the code but also the knowledge of the genre, which includes the knowledge of each construction, interpretation, and use. So a necessary implication of this shared genre knowledge is that it is not routinely available to the outsiders, which creates a kind of social distance between the legitimate members of a discourse community and those who are considered outsiders. So these second figures in the field of genre, there are also issues to consider. So according to Bathia, genres are defined by the tension between their generic integrity and their potential for innovation. So in fact, he argues that these two aspects of genre work together, that generic conventions provide the basis for innovation. And there is no better illustration of the saying knowledge is power, says Batia, than the one in the case of generic power. So this is particularly true, he says, when it comes to professional genres. Can you think of examples of how the power to use, interpret, and innovate particular genres allows certain people to exert power or control over other people? Now let's proceed to the topic D for ideologies in discourse. The excerpts presented in this section discuss some of the basic conceptual and analytical tools you can use to do critical discourse analysis. So the first is from Norman Fairclough's Discourse and Social Change, one of the classic works in discourse analysis devoted to the study of discourse and ideology. So in this excerpt, Fairclough explains the concept of intertextuality and its relationship with ideology. So the second excerpt is from James Paul G's book Social Linguistics and Literacies. So in this excerpt, G also takes up the topic of intertextuality, or as he calls it, heterologia. In his analysis of a level of an aspirin bottle, he also discusses cultural models and their relationship to power and ideology. So the first from Norman Fairclough's explain the concept of intertextuality. So what is intertextuality? So the term intertextuality was coined by Kristeva in the late 1960s in the context of her influential accounts for Western audiences of the work of Bakhtin. Although the term is not Bakhtin's, the development of an intertextual, or in his own terms, translinguistic approach to analysis of text was a major theme of his work throughout his academic career and was closely linked to other important issues, including his theory genre. So Bakhtin points to the relative neglect of the communicative functions of language within mainstream linguistics, and more specifically to the neglect of ways in which texts and utterances are shaped by prior texts that they are responding to and by subsequent texts that they anticipate. For Bakhtin, all utterances, both spoken and written, from the briefest of turns in a conversation to a scientific paper or a novel, are demarcated by a change of speaker or writer and are oriented retrospectively to the utterances of previous speakers, be the threads, scientific articles, or novels, and prospectively to the anticipated utterances of the next speaker. So there are also issues to consider in this excerpt. Fairclough quotes Kristevas as saying that intertextuality involves the insertion of history or the society into a text and of this text into history. So the question is, how do you interpret this statement? What role context plays in affecting the way we interpret past events and past texts, or what role can they play in affecting future events that is creating a social change? So now let's proceed to the second basic conceptual and analytical tools that we can use to do critical discourse analysis. So this is the ideology, social languages, and cultural models. First, heteroglossia by James Paul G says that it is important to extend our discussion of social languages by pointing out that they are very often impure. So that is, when we speak or write, we very often mix together different social languages. So this is a practice that the Russian literary theorist by Mikhail Bakhtin called heteroglossia, or multiple voices. To see a clear example of such heteroglossia and its ties to socio-political realities, consider the following warnings taken from a Battle of Aspirin. So there are examples that's by James Paul G says that warnings. So warnings here says that children and teenagers should not use this medication for chickenpox or flu symptoms before a doctor is consulted about Ray's syndromes, a rare but serious illness reported to be associated with aspirin. Keep these and all drugs out of the reach of children. So in case of accidental overdose, seek professional assistance or contact a poison control center immediately. As with any drug, if you are pregnant or nursing a baby, seek the advice of a health professional before using these. Product, it is especially important not to use aspirin during the last 3 months of pregnancy unless specifically directed to do so by a doctor because it may cause problems in the unborn child or complications during delivery. So, this text starts with a sentence of very careful and very specific information. Indeed, the initial sentence talks in bold about children and teenagers. It specially says, these medications give us an exclusive list of two relevant diseases, the chickenpox or flu, mentioned as specific syndrome, Ray's syndrome, and explicitly tells us that it's rare but serious. Then all of a sudden, with the second sentence, we enter a quite different sort of language, marked both by the pressing and by the disappearance of the bold print. Now, the text talks not about aspirin specifically as in the first sentence, but about this in all drugs, second sentence, and any drug, fourth sentence. We are told to keep this in all drugs out of the reach of children. But what now has happened to the teenagers? So we have get three different references to the medical profession, none of them as direct and specific doctor, which was used in the first sentence. The professional assistants, poison control center, and health professional. We see the different social languages in this text are sedimented there by social, political, and cultural happening unfolding in history. In fact, even what looks like a uniform social language, for example, the moderate middle of this text is very often a compendium of different languages with different historical, social, cultural, and political sources, and look to us now to be uniform only because the workings of multiple social languages have been forgotten and effaced. Next, similarity in the eye of the beholder. So one of the key ways human thinks about the world is through seeking out similarities. We try to understand something new in terms of how it resembles something old, and we also attempt to see the new things as a type, thus like other things of the same or similar type. And very often a great deal hangs on these judgments. For example, is spanking a type of discipline or a type of child abuse? When we answer this question, we claim either that spanking a child is more similar to paradigmatic instances of disciplines or to paradigmatic instances of child abuse. So judgments like whether spanking is discipline or child abuse are still open and widely discussed in the culture thanks to ongoing social changes. However, any language is full of such similarity judgments that have been made long ago in the history of the language, in other time and another place, and which are now taken for granted and rarely reflected upon by current speakers of the language. Next, we have the meaning. So, having established the context of social languages, we can turn directly to meaning. So, meaning is one of the most debated terms in linguistic philosophy, literary theory, and the social science. So, meaning, imagine that the reason I am making a distinction between two words where something is either the one or the other and not both, while Susan does not make such a distinction either because she does not have the words, because she uses it in the same way as she used sofa. When I use the word sofa, I mean it to exclude the word set as applicable. So, what is emerging here is that what we mean by a word depends on which other words we have available to us and which other words or use of the word. Example, sofa is meant to exclude or not exclude, as possibly also applying sofa excludes set but not couch. It also depends on which words are available to me in a given situation. For example, sometimes use the word love seat, which we consider a type of set, but in the above situation, it may have not viewed this as a possible choice. Perhaps this is a reluctant to use the term in front of close friends who might think it too fancy. So this is to say that we are currently using a social language in which love seat is not available. So lastly, we have the cultural models as the basis of meaning, choices, and guesses. Our meaningful distinctions, our choices and guesses are made on the basis of certain beliefs and values. So this basis is a type of theory. In the case of many words, a social theory. The theories that form the basis of such choices and assumptions have a particular character. They involve usually unconscious assumptions about models of simplified words. Such models are sometimes called cultural models, folk theories, scenes, schemas, or frames. So I think of cultural models as something like movies or video tapes in the mind. So we all have a vast store of these tapes, each of which depicts prototype prototypical what we take to be normal events in a simplified world. We all have a vast store of these tapes, each of these depicts prototypical what we take to be normal events in a simplified world. We conventionally take these simplified worlds to be the real world or act as if they were. We make our choices and guesses about meaning and relation to this word. And these also have issues to consider. The mixing of social languages that Key observes on the Battle of Aspirin is also a kind of intertextuality, sometimes called interdiscursivity. So this kind of intertextuality occurs when larger aspects of discourse like speech styles, social language, genres, and even ideologies are borrowed from others. So the question is, what do you think the reason for and the effect of mixing social languages were in these texts? Can you think of other texts that mix broader aspects of discourse, such as social languages or genres, in order to strategically advance a particular ideology or to present the authors or the readers as certain kinds of people? And Gies says that our choices of and assumptions about the meaning of words are often determined by cultural models, which are idealized version of normal, typical reality. Cultural models often involve ideas about certain types of people, such as bachelors, and how they are supposed to act. Consider the cultural model surrounding some kind of important event or activity in your society, such as studying in university or getting married. So what sorts of cultural models does your society associate with these events or activities? Or act as if they were. We make our choices and guesses about meaning and relation to this word. And this also have issues to consider. The mixing of social languages that Key observes on the Battle of Aspirin is also a kind of intertextuality, sometimes called interdiscursivity. So this kind of intertextuality occurs when larger aspects of discourse, like speech styles, social language, genres, and even ideologies, are borrowed from others. So the question is, what do you think the reason for and the effect of mixing social languages were in these texts? Can you think of other texts that mix broader aspects of discourse, such as social languages or genres, in order to strategically advance a particular ideology or to present the authors or the readers as certain kinds of people? And Gies says that our choices of and assumptions about the meaning of words are often determined by cultural models, which are idealized version of normal, typical reality. Cultural models often involve ideas about certain types of people, such as bachelors, and how they are supposed to act. Consider the cultural model surrounding some kind of important event or activity in your society, such as studying in university or getting married. So what sorts of cultural models does your society associate with these events or activities? And what kinds of people do the cultural models include, and what kinds of people do they marginalize or exclude?
D5 Two Perspectives on Conversation. The two readings on conversation highlight different perspectives within language theory. John Austin's work focuses on speech act theory, challenging the view that language use is merely propositional, conveying factual statements that are either true or false. Instead, he argues that some statements are performative, meaning they are actions rather than descriptions. For example, saying, I do in a marriage ceremony, or I bet initiates the action rather than describing it. Austin calls these statements performative utterances, as they fulfill an action simply by being spoken. Immanuel Skegloff, a conversation analysis, explores a different aspect of conversation, conversational closing, through the concept of adjacency pairs, which are pairs of related conversational elements like a question, an answer, or a farewell and response. Skegloff introduces the idea of conditional relevance, where the first part of pair anticipates a specific response, creating a structured flow and mutual expectation in conversation. Together, Austin and Skegloff show how conversations is more than conveying information. It's an interactive, action-oriented process governed by shared norms and structures. In this passage, John Austin explains that a performative utterance to be effective or happy, certain conditions must be met. The action of saying the words often central to the performative act, like betting or promising, but other contextual factors are typically required to make the action complete and valid. For instance, in order to christen a ship or marry, the person performing the act must be appropriately authorized, and other contextual requirements like acceptance in betting must be fulfilled. Moreover, the speaker's intention and sincerity are often necessary, especially with promises where an intent to follow through is typically implied. Austin categorizes these necessary conditions as felicity conditions and notes if any of these conditions fail, the performative act can become unhappy or unsuccessful. He identifies six key conditions grouped as follows: external conditions, A1, A2. A conventional procedure must exist with certain people and circumstances for it to be appropriate. Execution conditions B1, B2. The procedure must be executed correctly and completely by all participants. External conditions C1, C2. Participants should have the appropriate intentions and must follow through with actions that align with the performative act. Austin terms any failure in these conditions as infelicities. For example, if someone makes a promise without intending to keep it, the act is unhappy due to insincerity, although it is not technically false. This framework has broader implications, as Judith Butler later argued, with gender assignment. For example, a doctor's pronouncement of a newborn's gender can be seen as performative act that assigns identity based on specific social and institutional contexts. Austin's model thus suggests that understanding language as a performative depends on a visible action and underlying intentions, complicating the interpretation of each act. Immanuel Skegloff and Harvey Sachs explore the technical problem of closing a conversation, focusing on the organization of speaker turns. In any conversation, two key features exist: only one person speaks at a time, and speakers alternate in turn taking. The turn taking system ensures that after one speaker finishes, the next speaker is selected, which leads to an ongoing flow of conversation. However, this system does not inherently account for how conversation should end, which introduces the problem of closing. To address this, Skegloff and Sachs suggest that closing is managed through a terminal exchange, a specific type of agency pair, a two-part sequence of utterance typically produced by different speakers. For example, in a good exchange, one speaker says goodbye and the other responds in kind. The second pair of signals that the first speaker intentions to close the conversation is understood and accepted. This turn-taking system ensures that conversation ends with mutual acknowledgement rather than simply stopping, which could otherwise leave the interaction in an uncomfortable pause or silence. The authors also highlight the importance of context and conventions in this exchange. While goodbye in a common closing, other utterance like okay or thank you can also serve as closing markers, depending on the context. The use of such expressions ensures the conversation is effectively brought to a close, with each party confirming that they recognize the conversation's conclusion. This structure of interaction is institutionalized and varies based on the social norms, allowing people to close conversations in different ways and depending on their relationship and context. Skegloff and Sachs argue that while terminal exchanges often use agency pairs, like goodbye followed by a response, these pairs do not strictly dictate the placement of the first part of the terminal exchange. Instead, the first part is placed in reference to the overall structure of the conversation. Especially the closing section, they suggest that conversation's topic structure plays a critical role in how speakers manage transition between topics, with the first topic being especially important because they can define the purpose of the conversation. In some cases, conventionalists may want to avoid assigning specific importance to certain topics, such as not placing sensitive topics in the first topic position. This organization allows for flexibility in how topics are introduced, and conversations may employ strategies to avoid putting certain mentionables in the first topic position. For closing, the use of agency pairs ensures the natural transition, but it may not always provide a place for topics that were not mentioned earlier in the conversation. To address this, Sachs and Skegloff propose that the structure of closing exchange may need to allow for advance notes for foreshadowing to introduce unmentioned topics before the conversation ends. Regarding the conversation management, agency pairs help participants manage the flow of topics by preventing new topics from being abruptly introduced at the end of the conversation. This technique ensures that both participants are on the same page about closing the conversation without introducing additional topics. This approach may differ in non face to face communication, such as text messaging or telephone conversations, where the closure might not follow the same structure form. D6 Frames in Interaction. The article Interactive Frames in Interaction. Deborah Tannen and Cynthia Wallet discuss the concept of interactive frames, which are the interpretive frameworks people use to understand and respond to social interactions. Frames are essential for comprehending any utterance, as they define what kind of activity is taking place. Like, is it a joke or an argument or a game? The authors build on theories from Irving Goffman and others to explain how participants in verbal and nonverbal cues to signal the frame of the interaction. For example, a command like "you stop that" could signal different frames depending on the context, such as disciplining a dog or interacting with a friend. In a medical setting such as pediatric examination, the pediatrician shifts between various frames while interacting with both child and mother. The pediatrician uses different linguistic registers to match the frame of the interaction. For instance, using a playful, exaggerated motheress style when speaking to the child and more formal explanatory tone when addressing the mother. The interaction between the frames, such as when the doctor plays with the child before explaining the child's conditions to the mother, illustrates how both doctor and mother negotiate different frames in real time. These frames are influenced by linguistic choices, body language, and shared knowledge about the participant's role, resulting in a complex dynamic interaction. In the example from the pediatric examination, the pediatrician uses different registers to engage with the child, report findings, and communicate with the mother. Initially, the pediatrician adopts a playful, exaggerated teasing register when he's interacting with Judy, asking if she has a monkey in her car, which causes the child to laugh. This playful tone contrasts sharply with the reporting register where the pediatrician describes the medical findings in a flat, neutral intonation, such as detailing the condition of Judy's throat as a later educational review. Lastly, the pediatrician switches to a more conventional register when explaining to the child's medical condition to the mother, such as discussing Judy's muscle difficulty. Throughout the examination, the pediatrician fluidly shifts between these registers, Sometimes the shifts are abrupt as well as she transitions from teasing the child to reporting findings, while other times the shifts are more gradual, like when she moves from medical report about Judy's palate to explanation about this could relate to the child's breathing issue. These shifts illustrate the dynamic nature of interactive frames as the pediatrician navigates between different ways of framing the interaction based on the participation, the child versus the mother, and the purpose of each part of the exchange. In the pediatric examination, the pediatrician skillfully shifts footings the way she positions herself with each audience. To navigate different interactive frames, each requiring distinct approaches, and registers these frames include the social encounter, building rapport with the child and mother, the examination focused on medical procedures and consultations with the mother, discussing the child's condition. For example, the pediatrician entertains the child with the playful teasing while explaining her shifts to neutral flat reporting register when discussing the medical findings for the video audience, and adapts a conversational tone to explain the child's condition to the mother. The pediatrician's ability to juggle these frames can be cognitively demanding. Shifting registers, such as from playful teasing to clinical reporting, creates moments of overlap, like when the pediatrician asks the child if there's peanut butter and jelly in her stomach, only to evidently introduce medical terminology like spleen palpable in the same playful tone. The accidental blending of frames highlights that complexity of managing multiple interactive frames in real time. Moreover, these frames often conflict with one another. For instance, consulting with the mother can interrupt the examination sequence, leading to potential disruptions in the child's behavior. Similarly, the pediatrician's reporting to the video audience might conflict with the mother's need for immediate explanation, requiring the pediatrician to balance these demands. Through these frame shifts, and pediatrician only negotiates the content of the interaction but also the relationship between the participants, ensuring that each frame is effectively managed while keeping the interaction productive and aligned with the goals of the examination. In pediatric consultation, the mother expresses concern about the potential dangers of her child's arteriovenous malformation, prompting a response from the doctor that navigates multiple frames. The doctor shifts between the consultation frame, answering the mother's concerns, the examination frame, focusing on the child's condition, and the social encounter frame, managing the interaction with both the child and the mother. The pediatrician acknowledges the danger of the condition but minimizes its impact using conscious language. Only danger would be the danger, and comforting the nonverbal cues, smiling, nodding, and to reassure the mother. This careful balancing of frames demonstrates the pediatrician's sensitivity to the emotional impact on the mother, while also fulfilling the demands of the medical examination and educational videotaping. In contrast, when reporting to a medical staff later, the doctor conveys a more urgent tone, detailing the potential risk of condition more directly, altering the shift between frames. The interaction highlights the cognitive and social burden of managing multiple frames. The pediatrician must respond to the mother's concern without neglecting the child or educational context. Miscommunication can arise when the demands of these frames conflict, as seen in the moments when the doctor's language or tone shifts unexpectedly. The situation also underscores how nonverbal cues and framing strategies influence the meaning and emotional tone of the interaction, aligning with the Grossman concept of footing in communication.
The ethnography of communication. The two readings that follow come from two classic volumes on the ethnography of communication. First, Direction in Sociolinguistics, edited by John Gumperz and Del Himes or Himes, and the Ethnography of Communication by Muriel Civil Troik. In the first excerpt, Himes or Himes lays out the distinction among speech situations, speech events, and speech acts. In the second excerpt, Muriel Civil Troik discusses the concept of communicative competence.
One important point she makes is that since we are all members of multiple speech communities, we all must obtain multiple competence and sometimes negotiate among them, something that is particularly true for second language learners. Let's proceed to letter A, speech situations, speech events, and speech acts. Number 1, speech situations. Within a community, one readily detects many situations associated with or marked by the absence of speech. Such context of situation will often be naturally described as ceremonies, fights, hunts, meals, and lovemaking and the like. It would not be profitable to convert such situation in maze into part of a sociolinguistic description by the simple expedient of revealing them in terms of speech. Notice that the distinction made with regard to speech community are not identical with the concept of a general communicative approach, which must note the differential range of communication by speech, film, art, object, music. Such a such situation may enter as context in the restatement of rules of speaking as aspect of setting or of genre. In contrast to speech event, they are not in themselves governed by such rules, or one set of such rules throughout. A hand example may comprise both verbal and nonverbal event, and the verbal events may be of more than one type. In sociolinguistic description, it is necessary to deal with activities which are in some recognizable way bounded or integral. From the standpoint of general social description, they may be registered as ceremonies, fishing trips, and the like. From particular standpoint, they may be regarded as political, aesthetics, etc. situations which serve as context for the manifestation of political, aesthetic, etc. activity. From the sociolinguistic standpoint, they may be regarded as speech situations. Next, speech event. The term speech event will be restricted to activities or aspects of activities that are directly governed by rules or norms of the use of speech. An event may consist of a single speech act, but will often comprise several. Just as an occurrence of a noun may at the same time be the whole of a noun phrase and the whole of a sentence. Example, fire. So a speech act may be the whole of a speech event and of a speech situation. A rite consisting of a single prayer itself if itself a single invocation. More often, however, one will find a difference in magnitude. A party speech for speech situation, a conversational during the party for speech event, a joke within the conversation speech act. It is of speech event and speech act that one writes formal rules for their occurrence and characteristic. Notice that the same type of speech act may recur in different types of speech event and the same type of speech event in different contexts of situation. Thus, a joke belongs to speech act may be embedded in a private conversation, a lecture, a formal introduction. A private conversation may occur in the context of a party, a memorial service, a pose in changing sides in a tennis match. Next, speech act. The speech act is a minimal term of the set just discussed, as the remarks on speech event have indicated. It represents a level distinct from the sentence and not identifiable with any single portion of other levels of grammar, nor with segment of any particular size defined in terms of other levels of grammar. That an occurrence has the status of a command may depend upon a conversational formula. Example, I hereby order you to leave this building. For intonation, go versus go. Position in a conversational exchange. Example: hello. Hello can be used in greeting or as response. Perhaps used when answering the telephone, or the social relationship obtaining between the two parties, as when an utterance that is in the form of a polite question is in effect a command when made by a superior to a subordinate. The level of speech act mediates immediately between the usual level of grammar and the rest of speech event or situation, in that it implicates both linguistic form and social norms. To some extent, speech act may be analyzable by extension of syntactic and semantic structure. It seems certain, however, that much, if not most, of the knowledge that speakers share as to the status of utterances as acts is immediate and abstract, depending upon an autonomous system of signal from both the various levels of grammar and social settings. To attempt to depict speech act entirely by postulating an additional segment of underlying grammatical structure, example, I hereby X you to, is cumbersome and counterintuitive. Consider a case in which do you think I might have that last bit of tea is to be taken as a command. Issue to consider in the ethnography of communication. First, the distinction between speech event and speech situation is potentially ambiguous. Himes says that what distinguishes speech events from speech situation is that speech are not governed by one set of rules throughout. What distinguishes a speech event from a speech situation then is very much dependent on the distinction that members of a speech community themselves make regarding things like setting and genre. What are some ways an analyst can go about determining the boundaries of a speech event? Next, Himes' understanding of speech act differs somewhat from the formulation we are familiar with from Austin, see section V5, rather than understanding speech act in relation to felicity conditions. Himes suggests that we interpret speech act in terms of the speech event in which they are embedded, just as we interpret speech event in terms of the broader speech situations in which they are embedded. What differences does this reveal between the way the ethnography of communication and other approaches to spoken discourse such as pragmatics and conversation analysis understanding communication? Next, letter B, communicative competence. Himes 1966 observed that speaker who could produce any and all of the grammatical sentence of a language. Per Chomsky 1965 definition of linguistic competence would be institutionalized if they indiscriminately went about trying to do so without consideration of the appropriate context of use. Next is communicative competence. Refers to the communicative knowledge and skill shared by a speech community, but this, like all aspects of culture, reside variably in its individual members. This involves knowing not only the language code but also what to say to whom and how to say it appropriately in any given situation. Further, it involves the social and cultural knowledge speakers are presumed to have which enables them to use and interpret linguistic forms. Himes or Himes, 1974-1987, augmented Chomsky's notion of linguistic competence, knowledge of systematic potential or whether or not an utterance is a possible grammatical structure in a language. With knowledge of appropriateness, whether and to what extent something is suitable. Occurrence, whether and to what extent something is done. And feasibility, whether and to what extent something is possible under particular circumstances. The concept of communicative competence and its encompassing consumer and social competence is one of the most powerful organizing tools to emerge in the social science in recent years. The concept of communicative competence must be embedded in the notion of cultural competence or the total set of knowledge and skills which speaker bring into a situation. This view is consonant with a semiotic approach which defines culture as meaning and views all ethnographers, not just ethnographers of communication, as dealing with symbols. Douglas 1970, Gertz 1973. The system of culture are patterns of symbols, and language is only one of the symbolic systems in this network. Interpreting the meaning of linguistic behaviors requires knowing the meaning in which is embedded. Ultimately, all aspects of culture are relevant to communication, but those that have the most direct bearing on communicative forms and processes are the social and institutional structure. The values and attitude held about language and ways of speaking. The network of conceptual categories which result from experiences in the ways knowledge and skills including language are transmitted from one generation to the next and to new members of the group. Shared culture knowledge is essential to explain the shared presuppositions and judgment of truth value which are the essential undergirdings of language structures as well as contextually appropriate language and interpretation. Next is D8, discourse and action. Mediated discourse analysis, it is a remedial position that seeks to develop a theoretical remedy for discourse analysis that operates without reference to social action on the one hand and social analysis that operates without reference on the other. Mediated discourse analysis is a framework for looking at such action with two questions in mind. What is the action going in here? And how does discourse figure into these actions? In a sense, there is nothing very new or different about mediated discourse analysis in that is next, discourse and action. Mediated discourse analysis, it is a remedial position that seeks to develop a theoretical remedy for discourse analysis that operates without reference to social action on the one hand and social analysis that operates without reference on the other. Mediated discourse analysis is a framework for looking at such action with two questions in mind. What is the action going on here, and how does discourse figures in these actions? Virtually, all of the theoretical elements have been proposed and developed in the work of others. In its mediated discourse analysis, takes the position that social action and discourse are inextricably linked on the one hand. Liaraki and Fairclough 1999, but that on the other hand these links are sometimes not at all direct or obvious and therefore in need of more careful theorization. In mediated discourse analysis, there are five central important concepts. First, mediated action. Mediated action, the unit of analysis of mediated discourse analysis is the mediated action, not the discourse or text or genre. That is, the focus is on social actors as they are acting because These are the moments in social life when the discourse in which we are interested are instantiated in a social word, a social action, not simply as material objects. We use the phrase mediated action to highlight the unresolvable dialectic between action and the materials means which mediate all social action. Words 1998. We take the position that action is materially grounded in persons and objects, and that it's unproductive to work with purely abstract conceptual system of representation. Participation in the worldwide consumer society requires at some point the transfer of coins and cups, speaking and drinking. Conversely state, this transfer to coins and cups and speaking and drinking inevitably entail participating in the consumer society. There is no action without participating in such discourses, no such discourses without concrete material action. Next, a site of engagement. A, a mediated action occurs in a social space which I have elsewhere called a site of engagement. Scolo 1999. This is the real-time window that is opened through an intersection of social practices and mediational means, cultural tools, that makes that action the focal point of attention of the relevant participants. The idea of the site of engagement takes from practice, activity theory as well as from interactional sociolinguistics. The insistence on the real-time, irreversible, and unfinalizable nature of social action. Next, mediational means. A mediated action A mediated action is carried out through material objects in the world, including the materiality of the social actors, their bodies, dress, movement, dialectical interaction with structure of the habitus. We take these mediational means to always be multiple in any single action, to carry with them historical affordance and constraints, and to be inherently polyvocal, intertextual, and interdiscursive. Further, these multiple mediational means are organized in a variety of ways, either in hierarchical structures of activities or in relatively expectable relationships of salience or importance. Next, practice. Practice and social structure. For this mediated action to take place in this way, there is a necessary intersection of social practices and mediational means which in themselves reproduce social groups, histories, and identities. A mediated discourse analysis takes it that a mediated action is only interpretable within practices. Next, nexus of practice. Mediated discourse analysis takes a type of narrow view of social practice as social practices, ordering, purchasing, handing, and receiving, and so then sees this as practices, as count nouns, not as a mass noun. These practices are linked to other practices, discursive and non-discursive, over time to form nexus of practice. The concept of the nexus of practice works more usefully than the concept of the community of practice, which was the earlier framing, Scolo 1998, in that it is rather loosely structured and structured over time. A nexus of practice, like practices themselves, form one mediated action at a time and is always unfinalized and unfinalizable.
Good morning, everyone. I am Ian Delphine M. Ramirez, and I will be the reporter of two perspectives on multimodality. So, in discussing multimodality, there are two prominent perspectives that shape how we understand and analyze it. So, the first is linguistic communicative perspective. So, linguistic and communicative perspective is focuses on how humans use a variety of modes such as speech, gestures, facial expression, posture, and visual cues to communicate meaning and intent in face-to-face or digital interaction. This perspective is rooted in communication theory, semiotics, and socio-cultural studies on how humans engage in social exchanges. So, technological computational perspective is the multimodality refers to the integration and processing of multiple types of data in, compu- in, com- yeah, in computational system. This includes the development of algorithms, AI models, and systems that can interpret and respond to multimodal inputs such as text, speech, images, gestures, and even psychological signals. The goal here is to build systems that can understand human multimodal communication and respond in ways that mimic human understanding. So, this perspective highlights different aspects of multimodality, whether it pertains to human communication or to how machines process and understand multiple modes of communication. So let's continue. Language is often considered the most effective means of communication, as it provides informative content and can be used in various ways, such as phone calls, emails, and chat rooms. However, when considering TV or the internet, we also communicate through images, which can carry more meaning and reality than written description. This raises questions about the notion that language is solely responsible for the process of communication. So, heuristic units. A multimodal analysis of interaction involves understanding various communicative modes, such as proxemics, posture, gesture, gaze, spoken language, and more. So these systems are representation of semiotic system with rules and regularities attached. These communicative modes are emphasized by the interactional communicative function. They are never static units but always a heuristic unit, emphasizing the explanatory function and constant tension and contradiction between the representation system and real-time interaction among social actors. The term heuristic emphasizes the interplay between representation and real-time interaction. So let's continue to the final lesson is structure and materiality. Multimodal interaction analysis faces challenges due to the unique structure of language, gesture, gaze, and material object. While spoken language is sequential, gestures are globally synthetic, making it more difficult to complex gesture. In language, we can add a prefix to a word, making the word more complex. We can add subordinate clauses to the main clause, making the sentence more complex. But with gesture, this is not possible since gestures are linked to language informed about global content or intensity. So in this topic is language is more flexible than gestures because in language is you can always add anything, making it more complex, from prefix to clauses, subordinate clauses. while with gesture is it's nearly impossible to add because gestures are linked language about global content or intensity, so dili siya basta-basta maka-add to make it more complex. So good morning, we're gonna continue our topic, which is Corpus Assisted Discourse Analysis or CADA, pwede rin SADA. It's an approach that combines discourse analysis with corpus linguistic methods to study language in various types of communication. It involves using large structured collection of texts known as corpora to analyze patterns of language in discourse. By analyzing real-world example of language use and context, CADA provides a more empirical, data-driven way of examining language and discourse compared to traditional qualitative methods alone. So, ang CADA or Corpus Assisted Discourse Analysis is used by, we can see an example of that is news or newspapers, which use real-world situations, and also CADA is also more empirical, meaning globally used, and data-driven way of examining language than traditional qualitative methods. So they use more on data than traditional qualitative, which is more on researching lang. So discourses are not valid description of people's beliefs or opinions, and they cannot be taken as representing an inner essential aspect of identity such as personality or attitude. Instead, they are connected to practices and structures that are lived out in society from day to day. So the study of language using sizable organized text collection known as corpora is known as corpus linguistic. To find patterns in language use such as frequency, collocation, words that are frequently appear together, and grammatical structure, these corpora are methodically examined using computational methods. In this sense, assisted refers to the way that corpus data directs or improves discourse analysis. To get more solid findings about how language works in various circumstances, CADA makes use of big representative data sets rather than only introspective examination or small-scale data. So CADA really use big and representative data than using introspective examination or small data lang, because CADA is a empirical, meaning globally. So you really need big data or huge data to process and frequently use small data. So let's continue. The dynamic mix approach, known as corpus assisted discourse analysis, blends the advantages of discourse analysis and corpus linguistic. It offers an empirical, data-driven approach to identifying significant patterns in language use while taking into account that social and ideological settings in which language is entrenched by utilizing huge datasets and computational technologies. CADA continues to develop as a tool for comprehending complex discursive phenomena in our increasingly mediated world, with application in a wide range of subjects such as media studies, political communication, identity studies, and critical discourse analysis. So that would be all my report, and thank you for listening.
That would be all for our report. Thank you for listening.